This is the Dallas Morning News.
From the Dallas Morning News, I'm Abby McCloskey, and this is Beyond Talking Points. We thought we'd spend today on an area where there are absolutely no talking points, and that's the budget. I'm a firm believer that when things are hidden and boring, it's actually where the action is and what we need to be paying attention to. The reality is America's in uncharted territory. Our national debt is nearly the size of our GDP. Social Security's insolvency date is less than a decade away, and taxes are already at record highs. The country could eliminate the entire Defense Department, and that wouldn't come close to paying out the money already promised. Congress could tax small businesses and the rich at 100%, and still it wouldn't cover America's bills. To help us understand this wonky issue, we have someone who's both wonky and wise and fun, and who happens to run the nation's leading nonpartisan organization on the federal debt. I couldn't be more pleased to have Maya MacGuineas as my guest today. She's president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and a good friend. Maya, I was thinking that it is quite possible that you hold the world record for the person who has briefed more American politicians about the budget and the debt than anyone else. And so if you were just, back of the envelope thinking how many politicians you've briefed, members of Congress, presidents, secretaries, what is your number?
Gosh, I don't know. And as someone who works in a nonprofit where I have funders who love metrics, I really should know, shouldn't I? All right, let me just think. It'd be easier if it was like one of those consulting questions where they're like, how many potholes are there in the whole country?
Well, let's do the miles of road. Well, we could also just say that it's probably more than anybody else.
Well, I don't know if that's true. I think whoever runs the Congressional Budget Office at any one time probably does a lot. But I've been doing this job for 21 years, and I was starting to do budget briefings before. I do remember, in the beginning, when I was so interested in this field and was just getting into it, the first briefings, I'd never met a congressman. I'd never met a senator. And it was so exciting. The first time there was a member of Congress who brought me in and asked me the question of, how do you pay off the national debt? Which anyone who understands this issue knows that's really not the goal at all. And so my first experience was one where not all the questions that members ask you are the right questions to be asking. But if I were guessing, I would say it has, including group meetings, it's easily been 200 to 300. It's a lot. People do care about the issue. Getting them to do something, not such a high number.
Right. And now when you come to into the room as an expert in the federal budget, are you shooed out? Are you getting the same questions you used to get? Kind of what do people want to talk about if they want to talk about this at all?
Well, recently it's been me pushing myself into the room more than people asking, because that changed a little bit. Well, when inflation hit, people got interested again. There was about 5 years there where people really didn't want to talk about the issue. I think there's two big reasons, and it's kind of a theme of what I think about what's going on. One, there's just not nearly as good an understanding of the policy issues on fiscal policy, but members think they know them. So they think they know the way this works and what the problems are. And both sides kind of believe in narratives they tell themselves. It's all the growth of spending and all we need to do is cut taxes and they will pay for themselves. The narratives on the right, Some of the narratives on the left, that debt doesn't even matter. And for a while there was MMT. People believed you could just print your way out of it, which is utter nonsense. So there's a disconnect on the knowledge of policy, and people think they know a lot more, and they actually know a lot less. That's one issue. The other thing is the levels of polarization that we have in this country right now really stand in the way of our putting in place the fixes that we know are the case. You just can't get around it. In order to fix the fiscal problems, we are going to have to raise revenues and cut spending. Two things nobody wants to do. And
that's
cutting spending.
So popular.
Yeah, that's what I think is exactly right. So popular. And then that spending, it's in particular Social Security and Medicare. So that makes me even so popular with my own father, who's always mad at me, saying, keep your hands off my Social Security. But in a polarized moment where the parties aren't cooperating much at all, it's even harder to deliver those messages or get people to be really focused on it. And so what I've been trying to do recently is have them focus not just on that, but on what mechanisms are most likely to succeed. And I think, a fiscal commission where you actually build the knowledge and build some political cover is probably the most likely way of making any progress, which we so desperately need.
Well, on that first point you said about kind of confusion even over the basics, right? We're talking today to people who might not have a good grasp of the federal budget. I mean, even our politicians don't seem to. So just at the most basic level, when people say, some people, that we're in unprecedented times in terms of the budget, what do they mean? And can you break apart, again, high level, the components of the budget for me?
It's a great question. So the two big terms are always unsustainable and unprecedented. And unsustainable is something that the debt is. And the test of being unsustainable is the fact that our debt is growing faster than our overall economy. And when you have that situation, it cannot last forever. You just can't have a debt that grows faster than the economy. You will hit, it will not be able to last. So that's the one big point. What you're asking about, unprecedented. So we are very close to having the highest debt as a share of GDP that we've ever had in this country. The last time, the record is 106% of GDP. The last time we had that was just after World War II. And obviously we had just fought a world war and taxes went up to pay for some of that, but mainly that it came from debt. And then very quickly the economy grew, spending came down, and that debt was brought back down to balance in a very short amount of time, just a few years. We, on the other hand, are about to surpass that record in about 3 years without a world war. And the difference is it is never going to slow down unless we make some changes. It is going to continue to grow to record levels that we've never seen before, having profound effects on our economy and on our national security.
And so unprecedented is a term that gets thrown around a lot, and sustainable. Some other terms that get thrown around, like discretionary spending, appropriations, kind of the ratios of this pie. Can you just talk to us again at a high level of what components of the budget are growing out of control? Like, how do we think about this? How do we visualize it?
Right. So I never use charts when I'm talking, because the brilliant Alice Rivlin, who was my hero, always said, don't use PowerPoints, but I always end up doing charts with my hands.
I love a good pie chart. Yeah. I'm holding up my hands like a pie as we speak.
That's what I'm doing.
Maya.
I'm holding my hands in a circle. So here's our pie chart. Listen, the biggest part when we talk about the budget, you always hear people talk about discretionary spending, which is the 1/3 of the budget that needs to go through the appropriations process and be approved of every year.
By Congress.
So discretionary by Congress, yes. So discretionary spending has the biggest component. About half of it is national defense. The other portions are international affairs, education, science, general operations of government, environment, energy, all these pieces. A lot of what people think about when they think about the government. And that used to be the vast majority of the budget a couple decades ago. And it has gradually shifted where the discretionary spending has become a smaller and smaller share, from about 2/3 to about 1/3. And what has grown is what we call mandatory spending, or referred to as entitlement sometimes, which are programs that do not get appropriated every year. And they're basically programs which start with an if. If you qualify for it, then you will receive benefits. And so there's no cap on these mandatory programs. They are growing faster than every other part of the budget, the big ones. And the big ones are, this is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, public pensions, veterans benefits, agriculture subsidies, a lot of things that are programs that you qualify for. But by far the biggest are our healthcare programs and Social Security. And the key story in all of this is that those programs for the elderly, Social Security and Medicare, are growing much faster than the other parts of the budget, much faster than the economy, and they're squeezing out the other parts of the budget. And so we'll get to what people promise versus what's the truth. But when you hear people saying, I'm not going to touch Social Security and Medicare, it's actually impossible to fix the budget without touching those programs, because they're the fastest growing pieces of it and where so much of the budget squeeze comes from, both because of the aging of the population and the fact that those programs grow. Healthcare grows faster than the economy. Social Security is actually indexed both for inflation and economic growth, so it grows very quickly. But if we don't make changes to those programs, not only do they squeeze out the rest of the budget, they will become insolvent. Their trust funds will not be available to pay the promised benefits. And the people who depend on those programs for benefits will see incredibly abrupt, all at once benefit cuts, probably in about a decade.
Wow.
That will be quite painful for people who depend on them. And then just the final piece, sorry, I know there's so much to say about the budget. The final piece of the budget, which is more important than ever right now, interest payments. So there's discretionary spending, the biggest part mandatory. Part of that mandatory, other than programs, is interest payments, what we owe on the national debt. And that actually is the single fastest growing part of the budget right now because we have so much debt. And when our interest rates got higher, it pushed up the interest payments on our debt very quickly. And our debt is continuing to roll over. So when we get rid of old debt that was borrowed at low rates, we're reborrowing it at high rates. And that's having a really rough effect on the whole budget.
Right. And just to clarify, defense spending fits in that 1/3 and shrinking share of the budget, right?
Yes,
Okay.
exactly. Our defense spending is about half of that discretionary portion of the budget, a little bit more.
Okay, that's helpful.
And so it has to be approved every year. Exactly.
And so, everyone loves to blame people. So when you kind of look at the situation that we're in, an unsustainable, nearly unprecedented budget situation, kind of, is it the left's fault from COVID spending and big government programs? Is it the right's fault from Trump's tax cuts and military spending? What do you say?
No surprise that somebody who runs a bipartisan organization and deeply believes in cooperative efforts, and I myself am a huge diehard political independent. It's all of their fault, and it really is. And it is so disheartening to see the level of finger pointing. I can't tell you how many times, like if I'm testifying for Congress, somebody will always say, "But they passed those tax cuts, and that's the problem." Or if it weren't for Social Security, that's the whole problem. We actually did what I thought was a really useful study to look at this recently. The question was, at the turn of the century, we had budget surpluses. It in fact looked like we were going to reduce the debt to the point where we didn't have enough debt left. And that was the problem, right? Remember that?
I do.
I wasn't even worried about it at the time. I feel so foolish. We looked into the question of how did we get from those big budget surpluses to the huge, unprecedented, to use that word again, deficits that we have now. Another definition of or explanation of unprecedented in our budget, by the way, is we have the largest deficits as a share of economy in non-emergency times that we've ever had. So it makes sense that you borrow when you're in an emergency, right. COVID or a recession, you should borrow then. We're borrowing almost $2 trillion when there is no emergency, no pandemic, no recession. That's where the real danger is.
When you're saying the real danger, I think part of the problem with the budget, in addition to kind of all these different categories, is it's hard for most people to know, like, what are we talking about? Like, what does a collapse look like? Like, we're not Greece. We're the world's reserve currency. It kind of feels like we can play with house money. We've been doing it so far. So good. We got ticked down a little bit in, the credit score, but things still pretty the same.
Okay. Another great question. Let me try to answer both the questions about whose fault it is and how we got here with put a little meat on the bones. And why does it even matter? Because one of the biggest challenges is people are struggling with real day-to-day challenges, and they can see them, whether it's the cost of student debt or saving for retirement or job insecurity. Nobody sees the deficit. And so one of the biggest challenges of getting people to care is that very question. But let me first just say how we got here. It basically boils down to, and you have these huge storylines in Congress going, oh, if it weren't for all these tax cuts, we would have no problem in the budget. Mm-hmm. And if it weren't for the automatic growth in our spending programs, those mandatory programs, there would be no problem in the budget. Both are true. Both are true. We've done so much damage from tax cuts that were not offset and building automatic growth into spending programs so they're just growing on their own every year, that both of them are large enough to have caused the deterioration of the budget that we've had. If we hadn't had all the tax surpluses, or we hadn't had automatic growth in the budget, we would be at a point where our debt was much, much lower as a share of GDP than it currently is, we would be in fine territory. But basically, if you look from then, 1/3 of the deterioration in the fiscal situation has come from tax cuts. 1/3 has come from spending increases. And 1/3 has come from our responses to emergencies, both the Great Recession of 2009 and COVID. That third category is where we should have borrowed. I'm not saying every policy was the right policy, but that was the appropriate time to borrow. The other 2/3 boil down to having a Congress and a president that don't want to pay for things, and so they borrow instead. And there's another way to look at that, which is if you look at the difference between revenues and spending as a share of the economy, because there's all this automatic growth in those programs, Social Security, Medicare, the other healthcare programs. If you look at it that way, just how things have changed as a share of the economy, about 1/3 of this comes from lower taxes and 2/3 of it comes from higher spending because that spending is built in. It's not choices Congress is making as we go along, but it is something that's happening. So those are the numbers. Everybody has some blame. We actually often look at how much individual members of Congress added to the debt from their own votes. Yeah, there are a lot of people out there claiming to have been, on the side of fiscal responsibility who really have some pretty terrible track records on this issue. Let me go to why it matters, because a great economist once said that the deficit is basically the termites in the basement. You don't see them until it's too late. So when our debt is excessively high, as it absolutely is right now, bordering on that record, it weakens the economy by crowding out borrowing. So the public sector is borrowing and the private sector is less able to, can't make as many productive investments. This is true even when interest rates are incredibly low as they have been. It leads to higher interest payments, which is what we have in our budget right now. Crazy fact. Our interest payments are the second largest item in the budget. They are now larger. We spend more on interest payments than we do on national defense.
That is a crazy fact.
Crazy, like, it doesn't give it enough of the scary, ominous music in the back. But that is like a sign that a great nation is not going to remain a great nation if you're spending more on interest than your debt. And I hate to exaggerate ever, because you don't need to in this issue. It's so problematic. But I worry people will look back when the U.S. is no longer the leading economic power in the world and say, well, yeah, look at that. There was a sign. You cannot have, especially with all the geopolitical risks we have right now, you can't be spending more on interest than your national security or you are in trouble. So that's a problem. Big reason it's a problem is, like during COVID, you need to be able to borrow potentially trillions of dollars, certainly hundreds of billions of dollars, if your economy is about to plummet. And we are very lucky. We're the reserve currency. We're able to do that without any strain. So a lot of countries, if they're borrowing to fight a recession, that borrowing pushes up their interest costs. That makes the recession worse.
Sure.
That does not happen to us. But if we keep borrowing, it will. We will lose that incredible privilege of being able to borrow during times of emergency. So when I started doing all this, like worrying about this, it all came from this economic perspective that this is very bad for the economy, and it's also intergenerationally unfair. We're leaving the next generation. I got into this before I had kids, but leaving our kids, now that I have some, and everybody's kids, a huge bill of debt because we just didn't want to pay our own bills. And those were the reasons that this really seemed both dangerous, damaging economically, and immoral, in that what you want to do is leave an economy that's stronger than the one you inherited. But I will tell you, in the past couple of years, I have now become deeply, deeply concerned that this is really about a threat to our national security. And that is a result of, as the world has clearly become riskier, there are many more geopolitical tensions than we had anticipated there would be going on at one time. We cannot be dependent on borrowing from other countries to pay our bills, but we are, right? We still continue to borrow a decent amount of money from overseas. China has $700 billion of our treasuries. This is a vulnerability that you don't want. You also don't want to suddenly be in a situation where, if China invaded Taiwan, we're kind of having internal discussions and concerns. Do we have enough money to engage as we would want to? Or do we have enough money now to be making the kinds of investments we need to around the world to make sure that the U.S. still has the kinds of partnerships and relationships that we need in this time of higher tensions? So many things in terms of our own security. Like, are we investing enough in cybersecurity? A few years ago, I would have said there's plenty of savings from the defense budget that we could find to help with a big debt deal. My big concern now is while there's still those savings, there's a lot of ways we could save money. We're probably going to have to plow a lot of them back up into the defense budget as there are new risks around the world. So you have economic risks, you have national security risks, and you have a huge inequity to the next generation from the fact that we are borrowing not for good reasons. We are borrowing because it's just not convenient to pay for all the things we want to do.
Yeah, and another one to add to the list is that when austerity does hit, it tends to be programs that really vulnerable, poor Americans depend on that get cut. Like that's what we've seen in Greece. That's what we've seen in these examples. That it's compromising to the people who really depend on this type of support.
That's so true. I think it's particularly true in our risk that as you have two people running for president, swearing, absolutely promising not to touch Social Security or Medicare. If we don't, those programs face insolvency, and there is legally an automatic across-the-board spending cut on all Social Security benefits and provider cut on all Medicare benefits, which means those things won't be provided in the same way. That hurts the most vulnerable desperately. Like, we're talking about cuts for a 90-year-old widow and Bill Gates. And that's because our Congress would rather scare seniors, make political promises of not to fix these programs, though every single, as you know better than anybody, people who advise these campaigns, every single political policy advisor knows the truth. You have to make changes, but they're letting candidates go out there and just make dangerous promises. But it makes the people who depend on those programs incredibly vulnerable. And I think it's just, you shouldn't be in a position of power, responsibility, and stewardship and say, I'm not going to fix a program that I know is broken and there's huge risks to the people who depend on them.
Yeah, I agree. I want to talk about what Harris is proposing, what Trump is proposing, and then what you would propose. But there was a recent column by Megan McArdle in the Post, and this is talking about the left's point of view. And I quote, it's hard to think of any facet of American life that Democrats don't want to spend more money on: childcare, healthcare, housing, higher education, don't want to belabor it, ... If you ask Democrats how they'll pay for all this bounty, the answer is always the same: make the rich and corporations pay their fair share. And so the question to you, Maya, and this is both, I guess, with respect to the debt and also new programs that are being proposed, can we tax the rich our way out of this?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely not. Now, I say that believing the rich can definitely pay more. There are a number of taxes, a number of things we can change and should change, in my opinion, though I also believe everybody's entitled to different opinions about how they do it. I think it makes sense that the rich should pay more than they currently are. There's no way that's coming close to fixing this problem, let alone fixing this problem and paying for all those new spending promises. And where we are is in this really terrible pandering moment. It's just the same as promising not to touch Social Security, Medicare. Nobody wants to talk about this in terms of budgets are about trade-offs. If we want to do new programs for housing and healthcare and the EITC and the child tax credit, and the list goes on, that's great. How are we going to pay for it? And it can't always be this tiny 1% of people over there is going to do all of it. No one else will feel anything because there's not enough money. There's not enough money to do that. But that's a political story because then you can build support. It's a very popular way of describing this. And I think it's done real damage because it creates the sense there will never have to be higher revenues on people below $400,000, the middle class, because the truth is there will. In order to get the amount of revenue we need about 7, 8, 9, actually it's more like $9 or $10 trillion in savings to stabilize the debt just so it doesn't grow from where it is, not even bring it down to a more reasonable level, because we're about twice the average of the last 50 years right now. It's much too high. So you're talking about $10 trillion. There's no way that you can generate all that revenue without taxes below the super rich and the other side of the ledger. spending cuts. I go to, Democratic conferences all the time and talk about this issue. And people want to talk about raising taxes on the rich, almost in a punitive way. It seems like it's focused on being punitive rather than raising revenue. And they refuse to talk about cutting spending, which 100% has to be, and I would argue has to be the larger part of the savings overall, because the big growth is in spending. And we can't have the government and the share of GDP growing indefinitely.
Or what about, can we spend our way out of it? Like, what if we invest in things with a higher ROI, like infrastructure or childcare, education? Like, there's sometimes a case I hear made by those on the left, like if we just spent more on things that generate a bigger return, then it's kind of the mirror image of the Republicans thinking that you can grow your way out of.
It's the free lunch economics at every place you look, right? Like every person calls their program an investment, whether it is or not, and they declare that the investment returns will be so high that it's not a problem, which is not the case at all. Oftentimes when you hear those things, people are talking about the return on investment to the entire economy. Keep in mind, only about 20% of that is the return on investment that goes back to the government in the form of higher revenues. So just like cutting taxes doesn't generate enough revenue to offset the losses, those spending increases are not offset by the higher revenue, of the higher growth that's generated from them. It's that you might get a good return in the whole economy. Are those things we should do? Quite often, yes. I'm a big believer that we need to be doing some more investment in human capital than we are right now. But I wouldn't pretend it's going to pay for itself. I would look at how we're going to pay for it. And then on top of that, even if you had the brilliant investment, there's still a record level of national debt. We have to shut that. Right now, we're borrowing for all of our consumption. So if someone said, I'll trade you and I'll stop borrowing for all the consumption, can I borrow for my new investment? I'd take that trade. But right now we're borrowing for huge chunks of the budget that no one would even be able to pretend is investment. So we're far from that being relevant. Bottom line, no, this is it's just like waving your magic wand and saying what you wish were true. But growing spending and cutting taxes, it's not the trick to fixing the debt problem. It is the opposite.
Okay, well, I love a good magic wand. And if we're kind of moving to the right and to Trump, according to this organization called the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Maya, you might have heard of, yes, the 10-year cost of the legislation and executive actions of President Trump were about $8.4 trillion with interest, a lot of which is on his tax cuts bill. So can we tax cut our way out of this, give more money back to the American people who will create businesses and invest and grow, and we will shrink the size of the government by cutting taxes, and thus the problem will be no more.
I'm going to tell you a pretty bad story of like one of my worst professional moments. But no, of course we can't. Tax cuts don't pay for themselves. They don't pay for themselves. They don't pay for themselves. And serious conservative economists have projections of that all over the place. We know that it's not true. It is a great political storyline, but it's just not true. And in fact, in our score of the debt, how much was added under the President Trump, and we also did it under President Biden, we used dynamic scoring. So we included the growth effects. And again, even if you grow the economy, basically all the projections are that tax cuts only generate about 20 to 22, 25%, maybe max of the cost. And so you still are left with a huge deficit. So if you cut taxes by $1 trillion, it might produce $200 billion in new revenue from the growth effects. But hard to imagine it'd be more, often it'd be less. If you extend the Trump tax cuts, for instance, projections are that it would generate 1 to 14%, much lower even than that higher 20% that sometimes can be the case. So no, that doesn't happen. So I once decided I was going to have a dinner for a bunch of members of Congress and tell them, hey, here's the hard truths. These are the stories you tell yourselves that aren't true. No, tax cuts don't pay for themselves. No, spending doesn't pay for itself. Yes, you have to fix Social Security and Medicare. Yes, you have to raise revenues and not just millionaires and billionaires.
This sounds like a fun dinner, Maya.
Oh my God. First off, let's just agree, no dinners with whiteboards ever. Bad idea.
Were there cocktails?
There were plenty of cocktails. One person had too many and started yelling at me. It was really bad. But that's a terrible idea. Nobody actually wants to be told in a huge group of all the things that they're saying that aren't true. Nobody welcomes my hard truth message. And it was just a fiasco. It was so hard to get people. Half of them knew they weren't true, but they don't want to take the political risks of having to have different storylines. But what was scary was a lot of people really believe these. A lot of our policymakers really believe them. So I do think, one, never host another dinner that's about hard truths, figure out a different way to try to do that. But two, there really does have to be a bigger education about these things, because people used to know they were just talking points and that they weren't telling the truth, the politicians, but now they're starting to believe their own talking points. And so there's a real need for people to understand that there's just no way to finesse our way out of this. And for Republicans who want to cut taxes, who want a smaller government, here's how you have a smaller government. It's not by cutting taxes. It's by cutting spending.
Okay, but Maya, can we talk about cutting spending? Because I think one area, speaking of talking points and cutting spending, that gets no love is the deep state. And my cards, I'm a former Senate staffer. I'm married to a CIA officer, former CIA officer. We were in whatever the deep state is. But I think there's a thought that if we empty out, drain the swamp of Washington, if we shrink the government bureaucracies, and in some ways, Project 2025, which maybe you can explain for us, gets to this, and then that's the type of spending we can cut. Again, spending that doesn't really impact normal Americans, that gets people out of Washington who have grown too fond of the government, and then we can have a more sustainable fiscal path. What are your thoughts about the federal workforce as one of the unlocks for fiscal balance?
Well, a couple of things. One, you're sort of in a sophisticated way talking about what people used to say is waste, fraud, abuse, and that we can generate enough savings from just cutting out all the waste. And is there a lot of waste in the budget? Absolutely. The workforce is larger than it has to be, and not nearly as efficient as it should be. I mean, we all know that bureaucracies don't tend to create highest work, right? So there's ways to restructure that. Two, there are huge areas of government, healthcare and defense, where there are so much overpayment, industries that are capturing so much money, trillions of dollars on the line. There's lots of money that is going places where it shouldn't, where it's either outright being stolen or nobody's tracking it. It's too big to track. They're unable to audit the Defense Department. Yes to all of those. However, I really worry when people talk about, and so I should be clear, yes, I think we can cut the workforce. And yes, I think there's a lot of savings to be found. But I worry very much when people focus on that in the same way of saying, listen, there's not going to be anything hard we have to do. Because in the end, the big money, it's in Social Security, it's in Medicare, it's in other healthcare programs, it's in national defense. Like I said, I used to think there's a lot of savings to be had there. I worry that the world is so dangerous now. We lost our window for some of those savings. And so I am all for cutting out and making government as efficient as possible. And I really believe we need to bring in some new thinking to kind of do some disruption and how there's delivery of a lot of government benefits. But we are not going to be able to, this is not a word, efficientize our way out of this. We're not going to be able to, that is a start, and you need to know that your dollars are being spent well for people to be comfortable. But it is a start, but it is nowhere close to an end. There's a lot of real programmatic changes that are going to have to be contended with it.
And you had mentioned at near the top about a commission, just as we move from what Harris and Trump are proposing to what you think America really needs. And we had a commission, the Simpson-Bowles Commission on the budget when Obama was in office. It was bipartisan. They had a really thought out deal. You have to tell me, you might have worked on part of it, and it went nowhere. And so I think people are kind of left wondering, well, wait, we did a commission, it didn't work. So what do we do now?
So I didn't work on that commission other than once it came out to push really hard for its adoption, because I thought the things that Simpson-Bowles came up with were absolutely spot on. It was a $4 billion deal. It touched every part of the budget. It did so in ways that was very focused on growth, because I do think that despite growth won't fix this problem, it's important to focus on policies that are as pro-growth as possible, particularly because we have all these demographic challenges and our growth would probably slow down from demographics. So I thought the plan was great. I thought it was crushing that the President Obama chose not to get behind it and push for it. And there was so much support. I think there was one meeting where 80 senators all stood up and said, I'm in, let's do this. Wow. And they really backed this kind of plan. Yeah, it was amazing. And yet there was no opportunity to vote for it. A lot of that problem came from leadership. Boehner was terrific. John Boehner was terrific, but a lot of the other leaders just did not get behind this commission and stood in the way of getting any of these things resolved. I don't think commission is guaranteed to work. It's like one of the biggest efforts I'm making right now, but there's not at all a guarantee it will work. The truth is, we are so deeply divided and dysfunctional and distrustful right now as a nation. I'm scared nothing's going to work. I'm scared we're not going to make a change until there's a huge emergency. But I can't sort of sit back and be resigned to that. I think we still have to try. And a commission has the best shot because what it does is it gives a bunch of members a chance to work together. And we saw this in Simpson Bowles, build trust by understanding each other and understanding their values where that wasn't understood before. Don't even know each other. And they all put such bad motivations on each other instead of really understanding the difference between progressives and conservatives. And, none of them are trying to come to work and do terrible things for the country. They are trying to do what they believe in. They believe different things. So they need to understand it. But even then, what they really need to understand is they're going to have to compromise. To do this is going to be hard, and they're going to have to compromise. And so I think first helping them see what's really involved in this. We have an interactive tool called the Debt Fixer, where people can go play around and see how they would fix the debt. I sometimes have members of Congress run through that exercise just so they can learn what the real parameters are. And a commission gives them a chance to develop real expertise, some social capital between themselves, hopefully willingness to compromise because they understand the huge threats that come from this debt. As far as, not just our economy, but our role in the world. And then having commission would also give us a chance to kind of do an outside education game where you'd hopefully have a bunch of different people using that time to educate the country about why this matters and why our national interest really is at stake here. So no guarantees. I can't think of a thing that's more likely to succeed than a fiscal commission. And I know we can't sit here and not try.
Yeah, no, I agree. And would you see as part of that changing the budget process that like how we decide to spend money, not just what we're spending it on, but the whole process of going back to your pie of what's discretionary, what's mandatory, what goes through Congress, what doesn't go through Congress? Would that be part of it too?
100%. The fact that this country is operating more often than not with no budget in place, I think should tell us all it is time to really overhaul our entire budget process system. And if we were to get a debt deal and put one in place, you would then want to have budget processes that were strong enough to help keep it in place because Congress is very good at circumventing its own rules and restrictions. So you need to come up with a debt deal, but you also need to come up with a bunch of budget process reforms to change the way we allocate dollars and keep those fiscal constraints in place. And at the same time, I'd also say something better than the debt ceiling. So something where we wouldn't default, but there's something that would force action. That would also be helpful.
Two last questions, Maya. One, what drives you crazy about the talking points in campaigns when it comes to the budget or the lack thereof?
Two things drive me crazy. It drives me crazy that we're no longer a country that's willing to do anything hard, have politicians ask people to do things that are hard. I feel like we are, we're not willing to step up and do what's necessary. And many of us have been around while this debt was run up. The past few decades have been terrible. We're going to have to fix it. And I think we all have to be part of that. So everybody's saying, well, someone else should do it. That drives me crazy. The thing that most drives me crazy is people looking at differences and putting bad intentions on them. It is okay to be super conservative and want the smallest government possible. And it is okay to be really progressive and want the government to do more things than it does. Like those and everything in between for all of us that fall in between those two bookends.
Yeah.
Like we don't have to ascribe evil motivations or bad values to people who believe something different. Like, one of the great diversities of this country is that we have different points of view on the policies we want, the role we want government to play. We have to stop, vilifying people who have different opinions so that we can get to a place where we say, like, that's part of the deal of a big, diverse country, ideologically diverse country. Now, let's figure out how we're going to still function with that and use that as a strength, because I think it is a strength. So it drives me crazy that we've taken that and turned it into such a weakness of our own and left us in the state of paralyzed polarization where we are failing to address the bigger threats, not the debt. That's not the biggest threat we face. It's just the one that stands in the way of dealing with the big national security threats, role of technology in the future, all these huge things we should be grappling with. That our big debt makes it harder to grapple with them, but that's where our attention should be. And we should just be getting this stuff done and trying to act a little bit more unified and up for doing the things that are needed.
Last question. What do you want to leave voters with about the budget? Because I think this, like so many other issues, people can roll their eyes at, Washington's really messed up. And, there's two choices to vote for president. Neither one's talking about what needs to happen. And so kind of washing hands of it, like, guess we'd have no agency here to change anything. What would you leave voters with?
Yeah, I mean, I don't expect very many people to think of this as their number one priority. I'm probably the only person who goes and votes for the person who's going to both raise my taxes and cut government spending the most. I mean,
you and your party.
But what I really would like is if people say, okay, this is what I want. I want healthcare, or I want a big tax cut, or all these things. They would also say, but if they believe this, and I hope they do, but I don't think you should borrow to do it. I want you to budget, not borrow. I wish they would convey that to their politicians and say, I like those ideas. How are you going to pay for it, either through revenues or spending cuts, so that we're not just saying that's what we want and we want our kids to pay for it? Because that just can't be the answer we all believe is the right one, but it's the one that we are falling back onto really heavily right now, and it's doing so much damage to our country.
Listeners, we'll be back next week to sort through the presidential campaign promises and what America really needs. This podcast is running as part of the American Middle series at the Dallas Morning News. Please like us or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Abby McCloskey, and you've been listening to Beyond Talking Points.